Hey there, and welcome back to Mama Drama and Trauma. I'm your host, Jenny Kimmel, and I'm so glad you're joining me today. July marks a heavy milestone in this journey. This episode is raw, it's emotional, and it's one of the hardest months for me to talk about. Because July wasn't about my own pain anymore. It was about my boys' pain. It was about the emotional weight they began carrying, the confusion they couldn't put words to, and the anger that finally started to surface after nearly a year of trying to hold everything inside. July is the month when the fallout of the affair really hit them. It's the month they started finding their voices. And it's the month I realized, in the most painful, heartbreaking way, that I couldn't protect them from the consequences of their father's choices. This was the month where everything shifted, and this was the month where their hurt became mine. So let's go ahead and dive into July, the month that pushed me, stretched me, tested me, and ultimately broke something open in all of us. The shift of pain. July began with a feeling I can only describe as unsettled. June had finally given me a little peace, a little clarity, a little breathing room. I felt like I could see the world again without that constant fog of grief. But when July rolled in, that peace suddenly felt fragile, like it was resting on thin ice, and I could feel something changing inside the house. The boys were different, quieter in some moments, more tense in others, quicker to frustration, heavier in their bodies. I could feel the emotional temperature rising before any of them ever said a word. They were starting to process what had been happening for almost a full year, and the weight of it was finally catching up to them. And as a mom, as their mom, I could feel every shift, even the ones they didn't verbalize. There were days when the air felt thick, like the walls themselves were holding their emotions. There were nights when the silence in the house was louder than any argument. There were moments when I'd look at them and see something brewing behind their eyes, something they didn't know how to explain yet, anger, confusion, grief, disappointment, all tangled up in one. And it hit me in July. My healing wasn't theirs. My acceptance wasn't theirs. My peace didn't automatically give them peace. They still had their own storm to walk through. They still had their own emotional unraveling to experience. They still had their own heartbreak to face, the kind only a child can feel when a parent breaks their trust. I knew July was going to be heavy. I could feel it in my bones. And even though I had been preparing myself for the moment the boys would finally crack open, nothing prepares you for actually witnessing your kids break. Nothing. Because it wasn't about my grief anymore. It was about theirs. And watching them start to feel the weight of everything that had been done to our family, that was a different kind of pain. One that sank deep and made its home in the center of my chest. July was the beginning of that shift. The month where their emotions started rising to the surface. The month where confusion turned into clarity. And the month where I started to understand just how much they had been holding in. The boys and the weight they carried. July wasn't just a shift, it was a breaking point. And the moment I knew things were changing was that night in my living room. It was late, the kind of late where the house is dim, the lights are soft, and the energy feels heavy. The day had already drained everything from all of us. 2 of the boys were out with friends, and it ended up being just me and one of my sons. From the moment he came into the room, I could see it written all over him. Something was building. He didn't sit down. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even look at me at first. He just started pacing. Slow at first, almost uncertain, across the living room, around the coffee table, back and forth, over and over. It was like watching a storm gather inside his body. You can feel the air shift. You know something is about to break open, but you can't stop it. You just brace yourself. And then it started. He began talking, and once he started, he couldn't stop. Words poured out of him, fast, sharp, emotional, tangled, anger, hurt, confusion, all the things he had swallowed for almost an entire year. He vented, he cussed, he said things he'd never dared say out loud before. His voice shook at times, cracked at others. He was unloading the weight of the last 11 months, the truth he'd been holding, the feelings he didn't have language for, the heartbreak no child should ever have to navigate. And I was just there, sitting on the couch, quiet, still, listening, because that was my role in that moment, not to fix, not to soothe, not to jump in with answers, not to make it all better. My role was to let him speak, let him feel, let him finally stop being strong. I had never seen him like that, not in his entire life. This wasn't teenage attitude. This wasn't frustration over school or friends or typical teenage stuff. This was deep pain. This was the kind of emotional injury that comes from watching your family fall apart in real time. This was betrayal through the eyes of a child. And every step he took around that coffee table, every circle, every pass looked like him trying to outrun feelings that had nowhere else to go. There were moments I wanted to reach out to him, moments I wanted to pull him into my arms, moments I wanted to cry because the sound of his pain made my chest tighten, but I didn't. I stayed quiet. I let him empty everything he'd been holding, because sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do is just give her child enough space to finally exhale. He carried so much, months of unanswered questions, months of resentment he didn't know how to articulate, months of masking, months of pretending everything was fine, months of trying to be okay when he wasn't. And as he walked and talked, pacing, venting, unraveling, something inside me cracked wide open. All I felt in that moment was grief, a mother's grief for everything he had been holding in his heart. Not anger, not frustration, not even shock. Just grief. Deep, heavy, aching grief. Because no child deserves to feel that kind of pain. And certainly not because of choices they didn't make. I watched him, this strong, smart, kind-hearted kid of mine, finally let out everything he had tried so desperately to keep together. I saw his innocence slipping away in ways I could never reverse. I saw the weight he'd been carrying settle into the room like a fog. And I knew in that moment he had been hurting in silence, hurting because of choices he never asked for, hurting because he watched someone he trusted shatter the safety of his world. And I couldn't protect him from any of it, not one bit. When he finally sat down, exhausted, drained, emotionally raw, he didn't need me to fix it. He didn't need me to explain anything. He didn't need me to make promises or plans. He just needed me to be there, present, steady, a soft place to land. So that's exactly what I did. July was the month my boys stopped holding it in. The month their pain finally had a voice. The month I realized their storm was just beginning. And that moment in the living room, watching my child walk circles around the truth he had been afraid to say, is something I will never forget. Blamed for their emotions. If July taught me anything, it was this: sometimes the people who cause the most damage are the first to point the finger at everyone but themselves. And that's exactly what started happening around this time. The boys were finally speaking up, finally expressing their hurt, finally letting themselves feel the anger and confusion they had spent almost a year bottling up. And instead of listening, instead of reflecting, instead of asking them what they needed, their father turned it back on me. He blamed me. It became this default narrative in his mind. They're only upset because of you. You've been talking bad about us. You've influenced them. You're turning them against me. Suddenly, I was the reason they were upset. Suddenly, I was the problem. Suddenly, I was turning them against him. It didn't matter that I never talked bad about him or her. It didn't matter that I never pushed my emotions onto the boys. It didn't matter that I was the one trying to create stability, peace, and calm in a situation I never wanted. The logic became, if the kids are upset, Jenny must be influencing them. As if my boys didn't have their own eyes, as if they didn't witness the affair, as if they didn't feel the lies, as if they didn't experience the shift, as if they couldn't possibly think on their own. It was insulting. It was painful. It was infuriating. Because the truth is, they didn't like her. Not because of anything I said, not because of anything I did, but because of how she came into their lives, because of what she represented, because of what they saw with their own eyes, because they were old enough to connect the dots and understand what had really happened. And yet, there I was, being blamed, being accused, being painted as the reason for emotions that weren't mine to begin with. It was almost like their father couldn't accept that the boys were simply reacting to the truth. It was easier for him to believe I was the puppet master, pulling strings, whispering negativity in their ears, trying to sabotage whatever life he had built for himself. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. I didn't need to turn the kids against anyone. The truth did that. The timeline did that. Watching their family fall apart did that. Seeing their dad choose someone else did that. Losing the home they knew did that. Missing holidays and routines and stability did that. Their emotions were theirs, raw, real, authentic, unfiltered, uncoached, and being blamed for them hurt in a way I didn't even expect. Because it wasn't enough that I was healing from betrayal. Now I was also carrying the weight of being the emotional scapegoat, the one who got blamed for everything, their sadness, mine, their anger, mine, their confusion, mine, their discomfort with her, mine. Every tear they cried somehow became my fault. Every boundary they asked for became a sign I was brainwashing them. Every uncomfortable moment he had to face became something I created. And it was exhausting. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Because the truth is, I was the one holding them together, not pulling them apart. I was the one listening to their pain. I was the one comforting them when they were confused. I was the one answering questions honestly, even when it hurt. I was the one who never once told them what to think or how to feel. I was the one helping them carry emotions they didn't ask for. But that never mattered in his mind. There were days where I would sit in my room after the boys went to bed, staring at the ceiling and think, how is it that I'm the one picking up the pieces and I'm also the one being blamed for the mess? It felt so unfair, so backwards, so twisted, like living in an emotional funhouse mirror where everything reflects wrong and you're the only one who sees what's actually true. And yet, I handled it. I swallowed it. I chose not to argue because the kids' stability mattered more than winning a point. I chose not to fight because the boys' emotional safety came first. I chose not to defend myself every time because the truth didn't need defending. The truth was already living inside my boys. It was in their voices. It was in their questions. It was in their tears. It was in the way they looked at him. It was in the way they talked to me late at night when the world was quiet. Their emotions were never mine. Their pain was never something I created. Their anger wasn't planted by me. It was planted by the situation, by choices made long before I ever opened my mouth. Being blamed didn't break me, but it did wear me down. Because July wasn't just about watching my boys hurt, it was also about carrying unjust blame on top of my own grief. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, I kept going. I kept showing up. I kept being the safe place. I kept being the steady one. I kept holding my boys through emotions that should have never been theirs. And that became one of the quiet tragedies of July. I was blamed for feelings that weren't mine while I was the only one helping them survive them. The family meeting. Late July brought one of the hardest, most emotionally charged nights of the entire year. A night I never wanted, never asked for, and never imagined I'd be sitting in the middle of again. But I did it for one reason. Because my boys asked me to. They wanted me there, they needed me there, and I wasn't going to let them walk into something so heavy without support. From the moment they told me they wanted to talk to their dad, really talk to him, I knew something big was coming. The emotional buildup, the tension, the confusion, the quiet hurt they had been carrying, it all led to this moment. So we sat in the living room, the 5 of us, in a room that felt way too small for all the emotions inside it. The boys were nervous, I could see it, but they were also determined. This wasn't about being disrespectful or confrontational. This was about being heard, about finally saying the things they had been too afraid, too confused, or too protective to say for almost a year. I could feel their hearts pounding. I could feel their pain sitting in the air like static. And I could feel the weight of what this conversation meant for them. The courage it took to speak up to a parent, the fear of not being believed, the worry that their truth wouldn't matter. And then they started talking. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it wasn't chaotic, it was honest, brutally honest. 2 of the boys spoke the most. One hung back, quieter, still processing in his own way, but even his silence felt heavy, like his heart was sitting right there between all of us. The other 2, they let it out. They told him they felt the shift. They told him they didn't feel like the priority anymore. They told him that when they were at his house, they felt like the focus wasn't on them, that everything revolved around his girlfriend. They told him they didn't feel comfortable, they didn't feel seen, they didn't feel important. And they finally said the words they had been holding in. They didn't want her there when they were visiting, not because of anything I said, but because of how they felt when they were there. And it broke me to hear it. Not because I disagreed with them, but because no child should ever feel like they're competing with a new partner for their own parents' attention. No child should have to swallow that discomfort week after week. No child should feel secondary in a space that is supposed to feel safe. I sat there in that room, listening to their voices shake, watching their faces flush with emotion, seeing their hands fidget or clench or fold into their laps. And I realized just how much they had been carrying, how much they had been hiding, how much they had been protecting him, how much they had been protecting me, and how much they had been protecting each other. They had been trying so hard to keep the peace, to not rock the boat, to not make things worse, to make sense of something that didn't make sense. But that night, they finally chose themselves. They finally put words to the emotional chaos inside them. They finally stood up for their own comfort, their own boundaries, their own experience. They were brave, so brave, and I was proud of them in a way that felt almost sacred. The room got tense at times. How could it not? This was a conversation filled with truth, disappointment, and unmet expectations. But their father listened, quietly taking it in, processing what they were saying, even if it was uncomfortable to hear. And for the first time in almost a year, the boys weren't filtering themselves. They weren't trying to protect anyone's feelings. They weren't tiptoeing around the truth. They were telling their story, and that mattered. That mattered so much because this wasn't about punishing him. This wasn't about taking sides. This wasn't about choosing one parent over the other. This was about 3 kids finally saying, "This hurts us. This makes us uncomfortable. We don't feel like we matter in the same way anymore." Their truth deserved space. Their truth deserved acknowledgement. Their truth deserved to be heard without excuses, without deflection, without blame. And then came the moment I wasn't prepared for. After the boys went upstairs, the room fell into this strange quiet, the kind that feels heavy and fragile at the same time. He stood by the door, emotional and unsettled, and told me he was scared. Scared that if he asked her to leave when the kids were there, she would break up with him. He said it out loud, standing in my house, almost a year after the affair, almost a year after everything fell apart, almost a year after he had chosen her over our marriage. He was scared to lose her, scared to upset her, scared to set boundaries with her. And in that moment, I remember thinking, why are you saying this to me? Why am I the one you're leaning on emotionally right now? But he was unraveling, and he asked me for a hug. And after almost exactly a year, I hugged him. The first hug since August 12th, 2023, and it felt strange, not emotional, not intimate, just human. Just a moment of 2 people who shared a life but no longer shared a future. That hug wasn't about him. It wasn't about us. It was about everything the boys had just said, everything they had been carrying, and everything he had finally been forced to hear. What came from that night was the agreement that she would stay in the camper when the boys were there. And even though it was my camper, something I was still paying for, I didn't care. If it meant protecting my boys' comfort, then so be it. That night was a turning point, not for him, not for me, but for them, because they finally used their voices. They finally stood up for themselves. They finally refused to be quiet about how they were feeling. And for the first time in this entire timeline, their father had to face their truth. Not mine, not interpreted, not filtered, not passed through me, theirs. That alone made this night one of the most pivotal moments of the entire year. The first hug in almost a year and the quiet rebirth of me. After the family meeting, after the boys poured out their truth, after he walked out the door, after the air finally settled, I remember sitting there in the quiet of my living room and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not closure, not anger, just finality. It was the hug that did it, I think. That strange, emotionless, almost surreal hug, the first in nearly a year, that reminded me how far I had come and how much I had changed. The last time I had hugged him was August 12th, 2023, the Saturday after he left. That hug was filled with grief and desperation and shock. It was filled with the belief that maybe things could still be salvaged. It was filled with a version of me who didn't exist anymore. But this hug, this July hug, it was hollow. It was distant. It was the final exhale of something that had died long before that moment. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't maybe someday. It wasn't anything except human. Two people with a long history but no current connection. Two people who once shared everything but now stood on two very different paths. Two people who created a family together but could no longer stand in the same emotional space. That hug didn't hurt, and the fact that it didn't hurt told me everything. It told me there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to hope might magically change. It was the hug that set me free, not because of what it meant, but because of what it didn't. And after he walked out the door that night, after the boys were upstairs, after the emotional storm calmed down, I realized July wasn't just another month. It was the end of something and the beginning of something else. It was the month I finally understood that I couldn't hold everyone's emotions anymore. I couldn't be the referee. I couldn't be the fixer. I couldn't be the middleman. I couldn't keep cushioning consequences that weren't mine to absorb. July broke that pattern in me. It forced me to let things fall where they were meant to fall. It forced other people to own their choices. It forced me to start releasing the emotional labor I had been carrying for far too long. And strangely, quietly, this ending made space for something new, something small, something unexpected, something I didn't recognize at first because I had been numb for so long. I started coming back to life. And it began with a phone call, a familiar voice I hadn't seen in person for years, my cousin. We had always talked, always connected, always had these long, deep conversations, but life had pulled us apart in the physical sense. Kids, schedules, chaos, routines, distance, all the things that make you say, we need to get together soon, and then suddenly it's been years. But in July, one of us reached out. Honestly, I don't even remember who, and something inside me opened. I told her everything. The affair, the unraveling of my marriage, the truth of what I was walking through, the confusion, the brokenness, the rebuilding, the boys, the loneliness. All of it. She didn't judge. She didn't rush me. She didn't offer cliches. She just listened. Really listened in that deep, soul-level way certain people are gifted with. And then she invited me to a poker run near where she lived. The invitation came in July, and even though I didn't go until August, that moment planted a seed, a tiny spark in me that whispered, maybe it's time to get out of this house. Maybe it's time to live again. Maybe it's time to say yes to something fun. So I went, I got in my car, nervous, unsure, rusty at being social, and I drove out there, and we had the best time, laughing, talking, cracking up like we were teenagers again, slipping right back into a rhythm we hadn't had in years. And I didn't realize how much I needed that, how much I needed joy, how much I needed freedom, how much I needed to feel like a person again, not just a mother surviving trauma, how much I needed to connect with someone who saw me, not the broken version of me, not the betrayed version of me, not the survival mode version of me, but me. And then there was the moment that still makes me smile every time I think about it. I won the poker run. Of all the people there, of all the hands that could have been drawn, I won with a 4 of a kind. All 5s, all different suits. Tell me that's not the universe. Tell me that's not a sign. Tell me that's not some quiet cosmic nudge saying, you're coming back, you're waking up, keep going. Because after nearly a year of heartbreak, isolation, survival, and emotional exhaustion, I stepped out into the world again, literally for one of the first times, and I won something, not because I earned it, not because I tried, but because maybe, just maybe, the universe was reminding me that blessings still exist, that joy wasn't gone, that fun wasn't gone, that life wasn't gone. And as silly as it sounds, those 4 5s felt symbolic. 5 is the number of change, the number of transition, the number of new chapters, the number of freedom. And I had 4 of them. 4 new beginnings, 4 signals of transformation, 4 reminders that something in me was shifting, 4 signs that my life was not over. It was opening. That day with my cousin, the laughter, the easy conversation, the freedom, the fun, awakened something in me I hadn't felt in years. It was the first time I felt truly alive again. The first time I stepped outside my pain long enough to remember who I was. The first time I gave myself permission to feel joy after 12 months of drowning in grief. It was healing disguised as a day out. It was medicine disguised as laughter. It was rebirth disguised as a poker run. And that's why I will forever believe this. The right people come into your life at the right time. And she came into mine exactly when I needed her. Because July was the end of something, a year of trauma, a year of unraveling, a year of surviving. And it was also the beginning of something else, a soft re-entry into the world, a quiet return to myself, a reminder that joy still lives here too. And that brings me to the final truth of this episode. July marks the end of my first full year of this journey. 12 months, 12 chapters, 12 emotional earthquakes, 12 months of breaking, shifting, grieving, learning, and rebuilding. July closed the loop on year 1. Not that my story ends here, not that my healing ends here, not that the chapters ahead won't still carry pieces of the past. But the first year, the shock, the survival, the unraveling, the truth-telling, the grief, the anger, the betrayal, the confusion, the rebuilding, that chapter closes with July. And now I get to move forward. Now I get to start telling the stories beyond the hurt. Now I get to talk about the lessons, the growth, the rediscovery, the life that comes after the storm. Because July wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, a quiet one, a tender one, a needed one. And it was the month I finally realized I may not be fully healed, but I can feel myself coming back to life. Thank you for being here with me today and for walking with me through the final month of my first year. July was heavy, it was honest, it was emotional, but it also marked a turning point. And now that this chapter is closed, we get to step into something new together. As this podcast moves forward, you're going to hear not only the rest of my journey, but the kinds of everyday dramas and traumas that so many of us face. The things we don't always talk about out loud, but absolutely should. Healing, motherhood, relationships, identity, growth, letting go, rebuilding, all of it. And if you have a story, big or small, that you feel pulled to share, I want to hear from you. You never know who your experience could help, comfort, or inspire. And this space has always been about connection, support, and reminding each other that we are not alone in the things we carry. So if you're listening and you feel that nudge, reach out to me through my website or social media. I would love to talk with you, and who knows, your story might be part of a future episode. Thank you again for being part of this journey with me, especially through this first year. It means more than I can ever explain. As always, you are strong, you are worthy, and your story matters. Until next time, take care of you.